Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on attack surface management. My name is Tracy Easton. I'm the Director of Marketing here for Solutions 2. I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. So as we delve into this topic on cybersecurity, we do want this to be interactive and engaging. So please, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to just drop them in the chat or in the Q&A. We do have some time set aside at the end as well for Q&A, so we'll get all your questions answered. And I'm super excited to introduce our experts for today. We have Jason Norrid, who is the Solutions 2 CISO. We also have Jacob Burgess, who's a security engineer and lead product architect from the Solutions 2 team. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jason. Jason, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Tracy, for that lovely introduction.
You're welcome.
Jacob, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing good. All right. Well, let's jump into it. So thank you, everyone, for joining. We're going to be talking about our product, ASM Illuminate. But really, what we're talking about is attack surface management. And this agenda lays it out. We're going to describe and define the problem a little bit. We won't spend too much time on that because I think everyone here is well aware of the problem that we all face from nation-state threat actors and other bad guys, if you will. And then we'll give you our view of ASM, or attack surface management, and then how we see organizations addressing attack surface management, and then how we're addressing attack surface management through our product offering, ASM Illuminate. And as Tracy stated, we'd love it if this is interactive. So if you have questions, drop them in chat or in the Q&A box, or feel free to shout out. I think you can take yourself off mute and ask a question, but or send smoke signals. I'll try to keep an eye out the window and look for any of those, and happy to answer your questions as we go. So as we stated, just summarizing the problem, organized crime, nation-state threat actors, they have one purpose, one wildly important goal, which is essentially theft, extortion, destruction in some way, shape, or form. They have essentially almost unlimited scalable resources. They're, to my knowledge, the only entity in the world that has literally does have a money tree, in the sense of anytime they're running short on resources or funding, they can launch more ransomware attacks and get more money. It's pretty easy for them. They have a many-to-one attack model, meaning they can launch hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of attacks, and they really only need one of those attacks to get through. So they only have to get it right once. And then I do love this saying, we say it all the time, we hear it all the time, attackers don't really break in. That's not really all that common anymore. They just log in with credentials. And then the challenge becomes they just look like normal user activity. So that's the problem. Building off of that, business organizations, we're coming at this from the exact inverse. Typically, most businesses have one single purpose, their wildly important goal, whatever it is that they're in business, whether maybe they're a financial services organization and they're providing financial services to commercial clients or retail clients, or they're a healthcare provider, or whatever your organization is. But very few cases as your single focus purpose, cybersecurity. I mean, that's just not unless you're a cybersecurity vendor, cybersecurity is not your wildly important goal. And then most of the organizations that we engage with and I talk to on a daily basis, they all have the same problems. There's a lack of resources, there's never enough funding, and it's a one-to-many defense model, meaning we have to get it right every single time. So all those hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of attacks that get launched our way, we have to stop all of them, not just 99% of them. And then we're doing all of this while we're trying to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our ever-expanding attack surface. So it used to be years ago kind of a castle and moat diagram that we all used to draw when we talk about, defense in depth and layered defenses. And those items still apply, but the paradigm has shifted because the attack surface is now not just an office building with a data center with all of your IT assets inside of that building that you have to secure. Now we have an attack surface that includes all of our traditional devices and systems and applications, but also things like identity is now a part of the attack surface. Email and chat, our cloud, both SaaS applications, our Amazon, our Azure, all the things that we've deployed out in the cloud, all the applications that we're consuming, like those SaaS applications I referenced that are hosted in a cloud somewhere, that's part of our attack surface that we have to manage and be aware of. Networks, supply chain, including vendors like Solutions 2. We're part of that attack surface for the organizations that we're engaged with and do business with. So the problem is just getting larger and larger and larger. So our view of ASM, or attack surface management, is it really is all about security in everything. So instead of building a security model that's based off a specific, device security or identity security, it's really, you have to think about security in everything. And everything that we do, every new application we onboard, every employee that we onboard, every contractor that we onboard, and probably maybe even more importantly, every employer or contractor that we offboard, we need to think about how we're doing that in a secure fashion. So this includes cloud devices, privileged identities, and all the other things. So you really have to think about security in everything. So today, when we engage with clients, and Jacob, you've been on these meetings with me before, but when we ask clients how they're addressing this problem, typically we get this response, the three-step process. Consoles, lots of consoles. So the whole swivel chair management, meaning that there's a security analyst or an IT operator or someone that owns some kind of technical security role in your environment, in your organization, and they're managing security through tools. So they've got all the tools and all the technologies deployed, hopefully configured correctly and configured to adhere to your organization's attack surface. And then they're managing that security posture through all of these consoles. Many cases, there's very little integration between the tools and the technologies. So it's managing each one of those attack surfaces through a different tool and technology. And then the next level of maturity beyond that is spreadsheets. So you start extracting all the data because you're realizing these tools don't integrate natively with each other, and you're trying to extract meaningful information out of these tools and technologies. So you start pulling the data into spreadsheets, or in some database or a spreadsheet, something where you can then massage the data to get visibility to that. Well, the big problem with that is, one, you're pulling all this data out. It's point in time data that you're pulling out. And it's by the time you're finished massaging the data, and sometimes hours, days, or weeks later, the environment has already changed significantly. And then that leads us to our third level of maturity, which is just pure hope. You just hope that you're doing all the things and it's keeping the threat actors out of your environment. And I don't know, I've been to a handful of leadership classes. Hope is not a great strategy, in IT security or football or anywhere else. And all of this results in, I've already mentioned this, but point in time data, incomplete data, and then risk, lots of risk. And then from our perspective, if you have these items in your environment and you don't have visibility to them, we identify that as invisible and hidden risk. And by definition, invisible and hidden risk is really accepted risk to the organization. So if there's risk in your environment that you're not aware of due to assets or technologies or gaps in your security program that you're not aware of, that risk, intentionally or not, you've accepted, organizationally have accepted that risk from a risk management perspective. So key questions that we typically, when we're having this conversation with clients, is we'll ask key questions like how many assets. And Jacob, I don't know if you've seen anybody answer this, but in my experience, the answer is typically like, well, we have about this many assets, and this tool tells us we have this many. This tool tells us this we have this many, and this tool tells us we have this many. So we round up or we round down to this number, and that's what we call our assets. Well, just in that one sentence or that one conversation, that's hidden and accepted risk because there's unknown assets. There's not an accurate picture of the number of assets in the environment. And then, as you dig into that, are we comprehensively scanning those assets for vulnerabilities? And the key word there is comprehensively scanning. So are you continuously and comprehensively scanning every single asset for vulnerabilities and more explicitly exploitable vulnerabilities in the environment? And the answer we get there is typically, well, we run a ad hoc vulnerability scan, or we bring this third party in and they run a vulnerability scan, or maybe we have you as an organization have a vulnerability management program and you have scanners deployed and you're assessing for vulnerabilities. The challenge in these cases is those scanners are typically configured to run on a schedule. And in today's world, assets are not continuously on the network at all times. And so as assets are coming and going off the network, or assets that you don't know about that haven't been added into your vulnerability management program, they're not getting assessed for vulnerabilities, which again means hidden and more accepted risk. And then last, those assets comply with your baseline security posture. So I don't know, Jacob, do you have anything to add to that? Like, from assets not complying with your baseline security posture, what would be an example of, from your perspective, of that?
Well, if you say that, can you say, so let's say you've deployed a configuration management in Intune or a Workspace ONE, something like that on your mobile devices, and you say you do that, plus you maybe you have some sort of other monitoring tool or enrollment on those devices. So can you say, we say as an organization that we do that, but do you have evidence of that? And are you continuously basically checking that the tools and posture that you've said an asset should have has that? And that's really important, and also ties back into the vulnerability management. So on number 2, with comprehensively scanning assets for vulnerabilities, like that, I don't think you can credibly say you're doing good vulnerability management if you are not comparing that against a good and consistent list of assets.
Baseline.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, and another example would be, it's simply a simple one would be, do you have EDR, whatever your endpoint security platform, is that comprehensively deployed across your enterprise? And I think the default answer,
when it isn't deployed, would you notice if somebody spun something up? If DevOps or IT went and did something and didn't tell security or didn't follow the process, like, would you notice that device does not have EDR on it? So,
yeah. And the reality is, I have yet to have this conversation and ask these questions where I've been able to get consistent answers from security leaders that feel comfortable definitively answering these questions. And that's true of all of us. These are hard questions. These are simple questions that are incredibly difficult to respond to, because while they're foundationally simple things, in reality, they're very difficult to answer and comprehensively for your environment. So a couple things that I would say, I've had some debate with other security leaders before, or IT leaders. And so I have a couple quote unquote controversial statements that I'll throw out there. So vulnerability scanning is not equal to vulnerability management. So I hear a lot, I'll ask organizations if they have a comprehensive vulnerability management program. And they'll say, well, yeah, we scan for vulnerabilities once a quarter or once a year or even once a month. But as I start asking more questions about the life cycle, are you managing that vulnerability from the time that it's been discovered to the time that it's been either remediated, mitigated, or accepted? Because the answer doesn't necessarily have to be, by the way, I'm not advocating that every vulnerability has to be remediated or mitigated. It's perfectly acceptable from a risk management standpoint to accept the risk of that vulnerability. And in many cases, organizations are forced to do that based on technical debt or other things in the organization. The key piece, though, is understanding, managing that vulnerability and actioning on that, even if that action is accepting the risk, and then documenting that. So one of the common questions from a cyber insurance or other third-party risk assessments that we all are part of through our various supply chain, depending on where you're at in the supply chain. But does the organization perform regular vulnerability scanning and penetration testing? I see many answers to these come across as just an automatic yes. And as an industry, I think these questions are starting to get better, because now they want the, okay, when we say regular vulnerability scan, let's define what that is. So, and are you comprehensively assessing those assets?
The insurance companies have hired some cybersecurity professionals that are helping them write their.
Well, yeah, they have real data. They have real loss data now to track it back to, and so now they're asking both cyber insurance and just third-party risk assessments. The questions are getting better, and they're also asking for artifacts and proof and evidence of the assessment. So this is just something to think about as we move forward. This is a big one, and this is one where I would say I probably have had more heated debate, if you will, about this statement: auto updates not sufficient. So the question, from a survey or questionnaire standpoint, do you have a formal process to patch and update information systems, network devices, and software? And I think the default answer to this for everybody on the planet is always yes. But the reality is, having, for example, I'll pick on Google Chrome, for example, having Google Chrome auto update enabled for your enterprise is not sufficient for saying that you're patching all and assessing all Chrome vulnerabilities. You really still have to assess and identify if those vulnerabilities exist, because there are times where the process doesn't work. So doing what I call shotgun patching, where you're either doing auto update through applications, having auto update enabled, or just have a patch everything mindset once a month, once a quarter, whatever. Very rarely is that sufficient to really update and patch your systems and your applications. So we'll spend a little bit of time on this timeline, because this is the typical operational process that many of us follow in our organizations. So, and this is assuming that we have at least a vulnerability assessment process, and maybe maturing into a vulnerability management process. But step one, security ops or someone in security runs a vulnerability assessment. They generate a report. In many cases, even for a small to mid-sized organization, if you're doing a comprehensive vulnerability assessment of your entire enterprise, you're still going to generate a vulnerability report that's probably 500 plus pages long. You're going to hand that report off to whomever's responsible for remediation and mitigation in your environment. It's typically IT ops. So you're going to hand them this giant report. And the reality is, as soon as you're not in the room, they look at that report and they go, yeah, we don't have time for this. We don't have the bandwidth. We don't have the resources. We're constrained, because keep in mind, they typically have the same constraints that we in security have. And so maybe they don't chunk the report in the trash, but they chunk it off in the corner of the room, because in their mind, they're going to do a shotgun patching, what I call shotgun patching, where they're going to do a patch everything in the next patch window. And the mindset typically is, well, we're going to patch everything. Then those security guys can run their assessment again and tell us what we missed. The challenge with that process is the time. Well, number one, very rarely does the patch everything actually patch everything. But secondly, the time cycle, by the time all of this is done through this, however long this takes, whether it takes a month or 3 months or 6 months for just that one cycle to complete, by the time they do the vulnerability assessment again, it's another 500 plus page long. And the cycle just repeats indefinitely. There's not, very rarely do I talk to organizations where they're doing targeted remediation and patching. So these are some of the questions. I don't know, Jacob, if you have anything to add here, but these are some of the questions that I ask when we talk through this process with clients. These are through each stage of this process. These are some of the basic questions that I'll ask just to kind of drive thought into, okay, how is this process being done in your organization, and is there a way to improve this process? I don't know, Jacob, if you have any thoughts around any of this, or if you've seen anything different. Or is this pretty typical for the conversations you're having?
That's pretty typical from the conversations I'm having with clients. The thing that I think is really important and something that we're trying to do in ASM Illuminate is particularly on step 2 is if you know the organizational constraints and people only have so much time to do something, it's really important to the prioritization, and then the case for why you should do it now is very, very important. So if you have evidence around a particular set of vulnerabilities that have a high level of risk, that's a lot easier to convince IT operations or IT operations bosses that this is something that they need to drop, that needs to be brought up on the priority list. So out of anything, the story behind vulnerabilities becomes really, really important when you don't have enough resources to catch them all, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I'll just touching on a couple of these questions. In the stage 1 security ops running the vulnerability scan, is that scan assessing all assets, on-prem, cloud, remote assets that we all have, or most of us have, well, at least some portion, if not all of our workforce working remote. How are those assets being assessed for vulnerabilities? When you're performing vulnerability scans, are you doing authenticated scans? What I see in many environments that have vulnerability assessment technology already deployed in their environment, over time, credentials change, which is good, but credentials change in the environment, and there's not always that feedback loop to make sure that the vulnerability assessment technology is being updated with the appropriate credentials. And so the default then is just doing unauthenticated vulnerability scans against assets. That typically, based on the technology that we're all using today, typically provides way less detailed data about the vulnerability.
Almost you really no patch need to be information, no patching or
exactly. It's very difficult to get any kind of useful information about it from a security and IT operational standpoint. And then the big one to me is that second question on stage 2, the generate report. Is the report that if that's your process, if there's clear dividing lines between security, SecOps, and IT ops, is the information that's being provided from security to IT ops, is it actionable? Is it just 500 pages of technical vulnerability data, or is it being broken down into, okay, these specific actions need to be executed on these specific assets? And very rarely do I find it's being summarized in a way that's easily actionable by IT ops. And then, as I said,
the loop is important.
The feedback loop is incredibly important.
Because just on kind of a more I wouldn't call it like a shallow level. It's like people don't like to not be able to see if they fix something and not know, right? So being able to generate that loop quick enough so you can actually go back and when you're talking to IT ops again, say, look, you actually fixed some stuff. We know you fixed these things. They can actually see progress happen. Because if this cycle takes 6 months, like everybody's already kind of maybe even forgotten what was on the last report, and they maybe haven't gotten that kind of credit for having fixed those vulnerabilities. So yeah,
exactly. No, exactly. Well, and then doing on that last one, doing targeted versus shotgun patching. Ultimately, I think we all, and I'm including myself in this, we all do patch windows where we do a patch everything cycle. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm a very strong advocate, though, of also following that with very targeted remediation or mitigation. In some cases, a patch doesn't exist. So you have to create a mitigation strategy for that vulnerability, which is a whole nother level of conversation around potentially compensating controls or something else. It's configuration management taking place. A lot of times, in many cases, we're identifying vulnerabilities that are not resolved with a patch. It's a configuration that needs to be changed or modified on an asset or system. So anyway, this is the typical process. These are some of the questions just to drive thought into the problems with this process and maybe ways to think about improving the process in general. Which really takes us to this problem, which is what we're trying to solve with ASM Illuminate. So I'll first start with ASM Illuminate is really built with it is a product offering from Solutions 2. It is using some underlying industry standard technology layered with Solutions 2 IP, where we're driving a bunch of automation to resolve some of these process problems that we've been talking about in the typical process, layered with services to augment this entire process. So if you kind of look at this diagram from left to right, we start with, on the far left, correlating all the assets. And Jacob, I don't know if you want to maybe describe a little bit about how that asset correlation process works, like what we're connecting to, why we're connecting to what assets or what sources, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, so in the correlation step, it's mainly about getting the widest possible view of assets in the environment through tools that you already have. So we integrate on an API level with hundreds of different cloud tools as far as agents and directories or endpoint security software, as well as through a on-prem or inside environment appliance connecting to all the on-prem tools. So I guess the main thing to call out about the asset correlation is it's not a new set of, okay, we're going to deploy all these agents and collect asset data with an agent. No, it's you already have done all that work. You have all these tools deployed from various vendors. You're already doing all that IT, all that coverage. It's just kind of overlapping the circles of coverage to get and then correlating that data to get a good asset count and inventory. So
that's absolutely it. So we're leveraging technology that our clients have already invested in. We're arguably making that technology significantly better because we're finding the gaps of coverage with those specific tools, and we're able to easily identify where certain technologies that our clients have invested in have knowledge of certain assets and lacking knowledge of other assets. And we can do that comprehensively across the board, and we can do it fairly quickly. And then it drives value literally on day one of the configuration. And then that feeds into the asset, the assess posture stage, which is really where this is the point where we start with vulnerability scanning. So we're now using the asset data. Now that we have solid knowledge of the assets in an organization's enterprise, we can now do targeted vulnerability scanning where we can make sure that we're assessing all of those assets comprehensively for vulnerabilities. We can then catalog those vulnerabilities where we can break down the data and we're looking for vulnerabilities that are exploitable, not just theoretical. We're looking for vulnerabilities that apply in your environment, where you have the right set of or the wrong set of variables to lead to an exploitable vulnerability. And then we can catalog that. We can evaluate that against risk based on the asset class and what type of asset is, and based on the asset criticality to the organization, and the risk appetite to the organization, and evaluate that against the controls that are deployed on that asset. So, for example, an exploitable vulnerability on an asset that has EDR on the asset, on, let's say, an endpoint, versus an endpoint that has an exploitable vulnerability that does not have EDR deployed on the endpoint. Those are two different situations where the risk is significantly higher. So on an endpoint that has an exploitable vulnerability that is not running EDR, for example, it's possible that that asset could be compromised by a threat actor, and an organization will not even become aware of it until such time that that threat actor moves laterally into the environment and attempts to compromise something that is running the appropriate controls to provide visibility to that threat actor. So in our, our recommendation in that case would be, yes, you should absolutely remediate the exploitable vulnerability on all your assets, but a higher priority item would be getting the EDR deployed on that asset that has an exploitable vulnerability that's missing EDR, so you get that visibility and you can action if something happens on that asset. It gives you, EDR will give you that ability to, isolate a workstation or take some other action on it. So it's not a instead of, it's an and. You should both deploy EDR and remediate the vulnerability, but we can definitely work on creating the prioritization. So that's the assess posture stage, which then leads to that next last stage, which is the prioritize action. So this is where we generate a deliverable that breaks down that vulnerability data that's normally we've been talking about, that 500-page report. It breaks it down into actionable intelligence such that IT ops or whomever is responsible for remediation can take action based on what's going to have the highest effective, bang for the buck for their time spent on their actions to the organization. We can also update information based on that remediation activity, as Jacob referenced. And there's a feedback loop where this whole cycle just continues indefinitely. So asset correlation is happening nonstop. Posture assessment is happening nonstop. Prioritize actions is being generated typically on a weekly basis, but that can be customized as needed. And then there's a feedback loop for every step in the process to drive feedback into the previous process or into the next process, such that over time, essentially, we're breaking this giant process problem down into something where we're eating the elephant one bite at a time. And over time, we're trying to eat the entire elephant. The reality is there's always going to be net new vulnerability data, but this is about creating automation, orchestration, enabling the IT ops team and the SecOps team to work more efficiently and really mature their operational processes. And Jacob, I just spewed out a bunch of words there. Anything to add to that? Anything that I missed or didn't touch on in this process?
No, I think you got it.
Awesome. So in addition, as part of the service, there will be a quarterly security controls and architecture review where we will look at the trend over time as organizations remediate and mitigate identified vulnerabilities through the ASM Illuminate offering. We can also make recommendations around technical debt or any exceptions that have, any risk that's been accepted in the organization. We can look at that and make recommendations on ways to potentially either prioritize that or make other recommendations on how to better manage that risk. That's included as part of this on a quarterly basis. And then this just gives you a little bit of a breakdown of the next couple slides on what the report and deliverable looks like. It starts off with an executive summary that describes in general the state of the environment based on the data that's been collected, any big gotchas that have been identified, any missing significant control gaps or anything like that. This is meant as just a pure executive summary. And then we drive down into, these are just some examples here that have been pulled out of an existing deliverable, where we can break down hosts on the far left that require immediate attention. These are hosts that have critical and high exploitable vulnerabilities that are also missing endpoint protection. So these are hosts that we would consider to be in a critical state. I think, Jacob, one of the other interesting ones is the new assets in the last week. This is a big one. This is a big gap for many organizations, is the new assets.
Yep. And then aged out assets as well. Like, were you aware that these things were leaving the organization? Is something else that we track in the reporting. So
right. So assets that haven't reported in or been active within any of the security tools. Yeah. Did they leave?
Yes.
Or are they in an unhealthy state? Yep. Are they in an unhealthy state with the tools, which is a different problem? Or is that employee or that asset been offboarded, yet you're potentially still consuming a license for those assets within your tools? So there's a couple different upside. This isn't purely about security operations and reducing risk. There's also some potential savings here as you have better visibility to your assets in your environment. This can drive more targeted licensing conversations with your other vendors for the tools and technology that you own and invest in, so that you can right size your licensing. So there's potential significant value savings here. So you're driving a better ROI on the tools based on licensing. And then typically a kind of top 10 recommended vulnerability remediation actions. This could take different forms depending on the vulnerabilities that are being assessed and your assets and the types of assets that you have in your environment. But essentially, this is just breaking down into actionable steps in a typically in a, we'll call it a 1 to 5 page weekly deliverable. Obviously, that report can scaling it a little bit larger based on the size of the organization, but the goal here is to have something that's easily consumable for anyone in IT ops or security ops to be able to read it and comprehend the report and understand the required actions. So just some things to think about. So the goal of ASM Illuminate is to drive operational maturity and really accelerate that in your environment, so that we're reducing risk, we're improving security posture on a continuous and comprehensive basis based on the assessment of your organization's attack surface. And again, we're defining the attack surface as comprehensive. It's everything in the environment, not just the external attack surface, but your entire attack surface. So users, identity, assets, on-prem, off-prem, cloud, etc. But driving better ROI on the existing tool and technology investment, removing organizational dependency on recurring manual operational efforts is a big one, because right now, whether you're aware of it or not, it's very likely, if you're trying to track this and do this today, it's consuming a significant amount of manual effort and time and energy to try to build those spreadsheets, try to keep them up to date, try to generate meaningful data out of them. It is a significant time sink. And so the goal here is to give those resources time back in their day to focus on higher value items.
Because the cybersecurity resource is rarely a cheap resource to be having doing Excel magic all the time.
Oh, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
So,
no, that's a great point. So, but the same with IT, even if you have these are, the reality is doing crunching spreadsheets all day, looking from data that's point in time is not the highest value activity that most IT or security resources should be doing. Correlating data, looking for hidden assets, that hidden and accepted risk. you can read, things like the Verizon data breach report or other, just open the news headlines and read about the latest breach for many of the big, breaches that have been, talked about in the national press. In many cases, it came about due to a hidden asset, something that was unknown to the organization, some server that thought had been decommissioned but was still on the network, some other asset, either IT asset or OT asset that was on the network that was part of the attack surface and was unknown and therefore accepted risk to the organization. Another operational maturity accelerator is the comprehensive ongoing vulnerability assessment of all assets. That's very critical. Continuous device posture assessment. And then ultimately all driving to a point where you have knowledge of what your baseline is. Once you have that, it becomes significantly easier to start then assessing and reporting on whenever your posture drifts from that moment. And that, in my mind, that's a huge nirvana state that we all as security practitioners want to get to, where we understand what our organization's baseline is from a security posture on an asset by asset basis. And then we can see at a moment's notice when something doesn't look right. So it's very hard to tell and assess against your posture when you don't know what known good is. Once you've established known good and you've got to establish baseline posture, reporting on and getting visibility to drift from that posture becomes significantly easier and more valuable. So just some closing thoughts here in general about this whole process that we've been talking about. Traditional vulnerability assessment or remediation is failing. I've yet to talk to any client anywhere where they feel like that they are in a good and mature state around their entire vulnerability assessment or vulnerability management process. It's not just a tools and technology problem. The risk impact likelihood assessments that many of us rely on as we do risk impact assessments of our environment, many times it's built on tribal. We like to think that it's based on tribal knowledge of our environment, but over time, we have people that come and go, and that tribal knowledge starts becoming tribal intuition. So we don't really know, but we think we know. And so that's what I would typically call tribal intuition. And that's what's being used to drive our risk, impact, and likelihood assessments. That's not a solid way to approach risk impact assessments for your organization. You really want to you want this to be exact. You want known knowledge of your assets, which is what we're driving to. Don't allow your current processes to become a placebo. So and an example of that would be the quarterly patch window. Relying on the fact that you have a quarterly patch window or even a monthly patch window and that you're doing everything you can do to patch, it really isn't sufficient at this point in time. I mean, in today's world and our modern operating systems, there will be multiple patches released in the same patch cycle that require a reboot for each patch implementation. So in many cases, what we'll see is this backlog of patches, because based on the change window that organizations will have for their patches, even if they're doing a monthly patch window, they'll patch monthly, but they likely do not have the time to do the multiple reboot cycle required to grab all the patches from that patch window. And those end up getting punted until the next patch window. Well, it starts to snowball because in the next patch window, there's 5 more patches that require reboot cycles. And it just builds and builds and builds. And so the current process is you just don't allow that to become a placebo and think that that's sufficient. Strive for comprehensive and continuous assessment, however you can do it, and remediation mitigation of those risks. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, try to identify and eliminate hidden and accepted risk. The key is just identify it so that you can then action on it. And that action, again, may be accepting that risk, but accept that risk knowing that you're accepting that risk versus just accepting it without having knowledge of it. So those are the takeaways that I would recommend. Whether you're consuming ASM Illuminate from Solutions 2 or not, these are all things to think about in your vulnerability management process. If you'd like to look at ASM Illuminate in more detail, we are providing actionable intelligence to improve your overall security posture. We can facilitate creation of service desk tickets with specific actions to drive that remediation improvement with your IT ops. We can provide meaningful data exports out of your tools already correlated so that data is more meaningful, so that you're not occupying hours and hours of time building manual spreadsheets. And then, as I've mentioned many times, we deliver a summary report with prioritized actions based on client-provided order of operational priority, which gets assessed during the onboarding of the client. And then again, we'll do a quarterly security architecture review with you. And if this is interesting, let us know. We're happy to come in and provide an assessment of your environment. It takes typically about an hour for us to deploy the technology in order to perform an assessment, where we can immediately, we'll say from that hour of install, we'll let the data kind of run and collect for about 24 to 48 hours, and we can provide a meaningful report that gives you a glimpse and a snapshot point in time for that assessment of your overall security posture on your assets. And I don't know, I haven't been monitoring the chat, but Tracy, if you're still out there, have there been any questions that have come in?
I am out here, and yes, I do have just a couple of questions, but feel free to drop questions in the Q&A and the chat while we're going through these few. The first question, Jason, is, are you using AI?
So we're not using, I guess, AI as you probably are seeing it as far as like generative AI, as you're seeing AI referenced in the news, or all those security vendors. We are using a significant amount of data science, which is probably not a surprise to anyone attending this webinar. We're using a significant amount of data science to come through the data and do data correlation and to derive actions. So I guess in the computer science definition of the term, you could argue that we're using AI, but I wouldn't say we're using AI in the sense that it's being referenced today by most vendors or the news today.
Perfect. The next question is it possible to do a proof of concept?
Yes. So we can do a proof of concept. The proof of concept is very similar to the assessment process. It just typically, essentially, it's a prolonged assessment. So we can do either a quick, fast kind of point-in-time assessment, or we can do a proof of concept, which takes a little bit more time. Essentially, it's just running the assessment for a longer period of time to generate more data and more actions out of that data. And we're happy to do either or, depending on our client's time availability to run the assessment or a proof of concept.
And of course, how much does it cost?
$1 billion. No, it's completely free for us to run an assessment or a proof of concept. So if this is of interest to you, let us know. It really is I came from IT. I hated doing demos and proof of concepts because they occupied a ton of my time. It literally takes an hour or less to get this deployed and configured. It does take a small virtual appliance, although we don't have to run in a virtual environment. We're happy to run on, if you've got a spare laptop or something like that we can deploy in. We can deploy our software in your environment on almost anything. And it takes probably about 20 to 30 minutes for the deployment, and then another 20 to 30 minutes for configuration.
That is all the
Anything
questions
else?
I don't see anything
Awesome.
else. So thank you, Jason and Jacob, for sharing your expertise. Cybersecurity is so important. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us for the webinar. We will be sending out a replay of this for your use, or you can feel free to forward it to your colleagues. So watch your email for that. And then just also wanted to plug our LinkedIn. We do send out a lot of updates, keep up to date on our webinars through LinkedIn and website. Our LinkedIn is at solutions-II. And just once again, thank you for your time and your engagement, all the questions. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Tracy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.